Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. This week we're joined by Justin Carpenter. Justin is assistant professor of English at the University of Utah. He's my colleague in the English department, and as I say on the podcast, the foremost expert in the video game Kentucky Route Zero. So we're going to talk about KRZ with him in this episode. Justin is someone I mentioned on a previous episode in the context of the concept "mise on a beam," which basically it literally means being suspended in an abyss, but it typically refers to structures of recursion or replication, like a picture within a picture or a play within a play. We talk a bit about Mise on a Beam here in Kentucky Route Zero, a kind of perfect game for this discussion. But I will say, on retrospect, I don't think I asked him quite enough about his quite interesting and unique take on this concept. So we'll have to have it back on again so we can get the full download then. One last bit of housekeeping. We now have a YouTube channel. So please come find us at youtube.com/ at authors die twice. All of the episodes are uploaded there and will be in the future uploaded automatically. We also have some ideas for some irregular video related content, maybe featuring our faces, maybe featuring Twitch streams or gameplay clips. So keep an eye on that channel as well. That's all, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. Hey, Justin, thanks for coming on the pod.
I I don't know what to say here other than that I'm really, really grateful and excited to talk to you guys.
I mean, I'm particularly stoked because Kentucky Route Zero is a game that I tried to get into multiple times and
Yeah.
didn't finally like commit to it until I heard that you told me that you were teaching the entire game in your class, which seemed to me insane. And then I went ahead and just copied you and put the entire game on my syllabus too, and learned the game along the way, as I was playing it alongside my students. Um, and it totally blew my mind in multiple ways. And I think I've heard you say that it's like one of those infinite works of art, maybe like
Yeah.
James Joyce's Ulysses, or for me, D.H. Lawrence's Women in Love, weirdly is a novel that I feel like I could write a whole book on and then write more books on, I'm gonna have like
hmm
a 70-page chapter of it in one of my modernism book. So yeah, like I'm really, I mean, I feel really privileged and lucky to have you on to talk about this game because I feel like I mean, I think of you as being like, the world's foremost scholar in Kentucky Route Zero, honestly.
It's strange because not a lot of people have written about this game, although it seems like people who are writing about games all sort of know the game very intimately and were kind of part of the ride, either throughout or um, or just came to it because a colleague said that it was worth their time. I think it really appeals to humanities departments in a way that people haven't quite caught on yet. It's going to be I think it could be a useful tool for teaching games and art theory together, just because it literally is a treatise on games and what art can do throughout, right? Like it's really striking for that.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of damning with faint praise. And I think it's important to say that, like in this context, I think we also want to just sort of explain what's going on in this game for people who like aren't, like theory heads or academics, because I think this game is like it's a game that probably everyone should play, anyone interested in the medium
hmm
and the history of
hmm
the medium. But on the academic side, like which is our sort of personal professional orbit, like this is just like catnip for anyone who's interested in like
Yeah.
art, in theory, in performance and theater,
hmm
or in literature and their intersections therein. It really is, I think it's the ultimate gateway drug for academics into games because it speaks their language in a lot of ways. It's beautiful. The art design is stunning. I mean, the music is awesome. The idea, it's just like brimming with ideas. And I've already suggested it to multiple academics who want to get into games. It's where I start every time. Like anyone who's into literature, or even someone who's just a reader, like someone who reads books, I've done that too. An avid reader who doesn't know games but is sort of game curious, I'm like start with Kentucky Route Zero because it's very close to a written text. It has basically no friction, that you're not going to die in the game, in theory, but also
Mhm.
it's operating on the same wavelength as a lot of particularly sort of modernist and postmodern literature.
Yeah, I completely agree. I remember at the beginning of the process where I was actually for real going to be writing my my thesis, my PhD supervisor and I sat down and he kind of agreed that he should invest more time in games. And he was always he was familiar with strategy games for the most part. And I said, okay, well, here are a list of games that I think are worthwhile or interesting. And I think it included Papers, Please. And we had a kind of games group that we were building so that he could kind of be the outside view into what the game students were doing from the literary theory and political kind of angle. And so I said Papers, Please is a good example. Pyre by, what are they called? I forget the name. I always forget.
Supergiant?
Super Giant. It's not super massive, it's Super Giant. Um, Pyre, which is my favorite Super Giant game, is another really interesting example of systems leading to storytelling. And so we kind of played through a bunch of these games, and we ended up with the final two on the list, which were Disco Elysium and Kentucky Route Zero. And so we played Disco Elysium first, and my supervisor was just like, "This is terrible. I don't like this at all." And I've slowly realized, I think that a lot of people who like Disco Elysium are gamers. They're fluent in what games are to a certain degree because every time I show it to someone who's not initiated into that club or fluent in that way, they bounce off of that game much harder, surprisingly, than they do off of Kentucky Route Zero. And I think I've been thinking a lot about tradition and the ways in which Kentucky Route Zero kind of plays with that intentionality, who's controlling what sort of thing. Like who's writing this? Is it emergent from the fact of playing in a way that we usually wouldn't think about, literature, so on and so forth. And I'm not 100% convinced that it is, and then maybe that's why it's such a nice gateway. But it's also just the density of the work itself. It seems like nothing's happening, but on the interpretive level, it's just immense to even try to explain what the hell this game is. Like it's really, is it a game is a question that comes up a lot too. And I think it's just the perfect segue into that conversation with that art historical background, with the theatrical design experience, and the well-read nature of everything that's happening. Like they clearly have read a lot of theory. They've engaged with the history of different artistic mediums and forms in a way that we just had not ever seen up to the point of this game, in my opinion, when it comes to video games, computational at least.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in and just say this is my first time playing the game. I mean, I've definitely I know that I had a couple friends in college who, around the time maybe around the time it came out or a couple of years later were really interested in it. And so I know that I've seen it and I was just telling Nathan like when I explicitly the first time you get into the map and you're rolling around with the wheel to travel, like I have a vivid, memory of that kind of that formal thing of the map and that's how you navigate. So I do remember that part from years back, and I still haven't finished it. So I think I'm about halfway through, and I'm loving it. But Nathan, one thing you said was that like correct me if I'm wrong here. You said something about being worried at first that it was like a too smart game or something like that. And I do think that clearly this is a very like intelligent game, or like whoever made this made it coming out of a lot of, I mean, even just the sound design itself is something very studied, right? Like the way they execute certain like the forms and the textures of ambient music, for example, and the way that that's kind of referred to by, the musician characters in the game who are, what is it, Junebug and Johnny, I think, right? They have these kind of jokey descriptions of their genre, things like that. And I was like a little bit worried about this too, right? This could easily be like a too almost like a too winky type of game, right? But I think it succeeds in not in not doing that at all. Like I think actually the more you play it, it's more and more complex, but the complexity isn't the way in which it's self-referential, I guess, like is way deeper than you might expect, if you just read a bunch of theory and then went and tried to make a video game.
Yeah, I just want to sort of second that, Brian, and maybe contextualize my concern about too smart games because it's a very real thing for me, and I don't know if I've said this on this podcast before. I've definitely called myself uh what like the I've called myself the resident normie, and I'm also I would say the resident vulgarian, and that I just like to tear shit up in games. Like I want to be jumping around, moving really fast, driving really fast, or killing things. And so I have an instinctive allergy to games that are ideas based, which is kind of funny for the fact that we're on a podcast about games and aesthetic theory. But yeah, like I have an instinctual suspicion of games that are want to impress you or demonstrate right off the bat how smart or how literary they are. And I would say for me, again, as I'm going to out myself as never having played more than an hour of Disco Elysium because I just cannot get through it. And it's a really useful comparison, Justin, because these are both games that seem like they would be a perfect, entry point for a non-gamer and someone who's a reader, or interested in literature. But Disco Elysium has a way, I mean, for one, I find it sort of visually and sonically impoverished. Like it's got what I played had an interesting soundtrack, interesting voice acting, has a distinct visual style, but it just doesn't do anything for me. It's like it's a lot of like neutral tones and it just doesn't jump off the screen. Uh, and and it's so full of text and like it's so wordy, and my feeling, honestly, like I'm just gonna like my sort of lizard brain response to Disco Elysium, like I know it's supposed to be one of the greatest games of all time and one of the smartest games of all time, is just like why don't you just write a book? Like I'd rather just read a book. Like I'd rather read a book and have control over the narrative and the ideas, or like rather control sort of my reception of it at my own pace, rather than have to like engage with these sort of classic RPG systems that are like pretty obscure, as you said, like pretty steep in the history of of computer RPG games, just to get through to the ideas and the narrative. Whereas Kentucky Route Zero is not wordy. I mean, there's plenty of dialogue, but like it hits you immediately with that like iconic image of Equus Oils, which is just like this gorgeous visual, landscape and environment. It hits you immediately with its soundscape, like the sounds of the road and the sort of ambient noise and then the music. Like it's a game that leads, I think, with its sound, its music, and its visuals over and beyond its ideas and its pure writing. And that in a way makes me feel like, okay, this is speaking the language of, experimental theater, experimental art, whatever, but it's doing it in a kind of visually and aurally stimulating way. It's doing it in a game in a way that feels like I'm experiencing the medium really, not, whereas Disco Elysium I felt just from the opening that opening sort of, you know, um, cogito like moment where you have the voice out of the darkness sort of manifesting reality in sort of hungover state. That just, I don't feel like I'm playing a game when like to speak crudely, I feel like I'm just reading. I'm just like reading, I'm clicking, I'm reading. Um, I think one of the great strengths of KRZ is just precisely how it's sensuously stimulating and engaging and beautiful in the way that other like smart games, like Papers, Please is another great example, which is just like so dreary, it's like so depressing, and it's depressing to look at. And that's not at all the case here.
When I think of dreary, smart games, I always think of This War of Mine. Have you played it? It's even more tabletop-y style, but it's like a survival tabletop-y game about uh, just awful events happening and how you survive that and how you can't trust anyone. And it's impossible to get through because first of all, I think that the point is kind of immediately apparent when you turn on something like Disco Elysium. Uh, and again, this game's not going Disco Elysium. Maybe we should talk about it another time because it's not going to get much love from me either. I personally don't find it particularly interesting for different reasons, actually, than but also the reasons that you've listed here. But I won't get into it. I just think that with Kentucky Route Zero and having taught it in a classroom environment with students who are predominantly students of game design, the one thing that I always see whenever I teach this game, there's always people who are just not going to resonate with it, but that's normal. But the students who resonate with it, they always have this just like silent look of shock that it meant so much to them. And they were willing to go wherever it took them because I think of the unification of what you're saying here. Like the story itself is not foremost, but it's also not it's quite evident in the structure of the text as well. Like the idea of debt and haunting and all these different uh, we can call them topics or themes that the game kind of meditates on. Death is another really good example. The it never I think in games we're used to like quite strong literalization, and games as an art form have really struggled with just being like so literal that it's hard to find that expressive dimension that we typically think of when we think of engaging with an artwork. And as we've seen game designers get more and more familiar with the tools and explore the tools themselves, um, I think that Kentucky Route Zero kind of sets the trend in that direction of what are the materials of this medium, and it turns out to be all the materials of all mediums. And so the game not only unifies the formal dimension or the technical dimension with its content, for example, the idea that nothing has a home any longer. I mean, media is the exact same thing. It all resides in the same ether that we do. And so there's this kind of like mutual feeling with the objects of our capacity to express ourselves that leads to this like mysteriousness and open-endedness that people just strongly relate to on a personal lived experience level, which is really strange to see. But it really is the most Brechtian work that it's more Brechtian than Brecht in the sense that, sorry for the maybe the, I don't know what tone we're going for here exactly, but it's this revelation of the theatricalness and the relationship of art directly embedded in your everyday lived experience that you're passively watching TV while characters have deep existential conversations, and somehow the TV passively playing something just starts to really make you emotional in a way that you didn't expect because you're finally being, I mean, you're being drawn to pay attention to all these different forms of mediation and how they plug into each other or don't. And the, relative poverty and homelessness of all of it in this digital whatever database of forms that it's like this pure virtual space where we navigate through pure object-oriented, non-hierarchical forms of navigation. Bit of a word salad there, but what I mean is that you're not navigating in the I'm going to the northwest quadrant of this map after a certain point. You're just navigating different forms. And there's no rhyme or reason, at least immediately, that's given for why they're arranged in this way and why you can navigate it this way and not that way. And it just creates this sense of deep mystery on the level of mediation itself, which then reverberates back to you in the sense of like, am I really controlling this? Am I really interacting with this? And at the same time, the characters themselves don't seem to be interacting with the worlds around them either.
The question of navigation is really rich, and it brings me to, well, the thought that maybe we should take a step back and just contextualize the game a little bit and describe how it is, how it is. That's as the title of the great Samuel Beckett novel. Describe what it is and how it works. And maybe Brian, you could, I mean, it would be really interesting to hear your sense of like what this text slash work even is as someone who's totally new to it. Um, yeah, what do you both think?
I mean, I'll take a quick stab, but first, before I lose the thought, I just want to say, Justin, the point you just made a few minutes ago about how the game and art in general. And I think you said the all materials of all mediums. I like that way of kind of phrasing it, right? There's not this kind of superficial separation that we are taught. You know, we get taught and then we have to unlearn, and then somehow we get dialectically back to understanding that works of art are just other things in the world along with us, you know. Makes it I will give an attempt at a description in a second, but it makes me think a lot of how this game, usually we've I think alluded to this a little bit before, but like the games increasingly have a spectacular quality to them today, right? Like in terms of, when you have a real experience with a game or an aesthetic experience, it's going to be some kind of like big vista or some spectacle or some amazing feat of, technical prowess or whatever. And I find, I mean, this game is rendered I mean, it's very impressive. It's a beautiful game. The sound design is amazing, and but I find myself drawn most of all to the writing, actually, like the actual descriptions that characters give to us. And so actually the most of the times where I've had some kind of spark of experience within myself while playing this game, it's been actually when reading things that characters are describing that happened sometime before, like makes me think, particularly, I think it was the character Shannon, I think, describes this moment with a bird cage where she's like sitting and looking at a bird in a bird cage, and it just seems to be this like she herself is having this kind of maybe aesthetic experience looking at a bird cage, and it is kind of meaningless, and we don't get a representation of it, which I think is the correct choice by the developers to like not show us this, right? I mean, to have it just described in language. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside that maybe we can return to later, but uh, for listeners, I guess who haven't played the game or don't know it, and I'll just say a little bit and let you guys maybe tack on and correct me here, but you're playing at least seemingly most of the time. I guess I'm still, only a little over halfway through, but as this character named Conway, who's a sort of delivery driver guy for an antique store, and that's kind of the mise en scène you get at the beginning of the game. You show up at this kind of gas station in your truck. You have a kind of like dog companion who it refers to at certain points as wearing a straw hat, I think, right? So this dog is kind of like a similarly grizzled, road dog, kind of road champion, just like Conway is. We also get hints that Conway's, a recovering or recovered alcoholic, which they're really subtle hints, but that seems, which I haven't played Disco Elysium, but that's also, I think, a big part of the kind of narrative setup of Disco Elysium too, from what I understand. Um, and maybe we can talk a little bit about what that does for this game too in terms of narrative reflexivity or whatever. But yeah, you basically are trying to find this address that you hear only exists on Route Zero, or as it's referred to, the Zero. And so the first kind of leg of the game, you're trying to figure out how to get to the Zero. The Zero is represented as this weird, it almost to me looks like a fish bones or something, the way that it's represented. It's this just totally circular uh, path or weird loop that you travel on, but you have to keep switching back and forth depending on which, I think Justin, as you said, like which forms pop up. Certain forms will come up, and then you have to kind of return from that form and go in the other direction. Um, I think I'll pause there because I don't want to I mean, it's a very bizarre game, so it's really hard to kind of actually summarize. It's maybe more the job is just to describe what it's like to actually play it, which is a lot of text heavy, no combat as far as I can tell, right? There's no, as you said, Nathan, there's no threat of death or anything like that. But there also does seem to be a pretty big threat of death, but maybe not like a ludic death, I guess. But yeah, I'll pause here.
Yeah, I think that's actually, yeah, that's generally what's happening throughout, I would say, the whole game. In different ways that I won't, I mean, I don't want to just drop out what happens in the latter half of the game without kind of talking about how it builds towards it. And I actually think the the point about Conway being a recovering alcoholic is a, again, we have to put a pin in Disco Elysium perhaps for the sake of talking about Kentucky Route Zero, but it is a difference because Kentucky Route Zero kind of creates mystery out of it, and then resoundingly answers it in a way that's surprising given it's surprising, but when you actually analyze the whole work, it's extremely consistent and they've built up towards it. Where at some point, please forgive me, uh, you're given an option of refusing a drink on behalf of Conway, and he nonetheless takes the drink. Whether you say he doesn't want it or not, he kind of shakily takes it despite the player's controls. And it's one of the first examples of that being that control being so literally taken away from you. But the whole game is reminding you all the time that you're not really controlling these characters directly or at all. And so I think the way that it builds throughout the course of the text, it's really cool that you notice it so early on because one of the things I noticed the first time I played Kentucky Route Zero was that I wanted to kind of treat him as a fully recovered alcoholic. Like there's this tendency to try and just behave as though he's not trying to talk about this or insinuate this. So you can choose descriptions that just kind of excise that fact out of the text, but there's this moment that just inevitably occurs where Conway gives into what he has struggled with for so long. And I think that that kind of sets the standard for what Kentucky Route Zero is doing. Like you can choose to not describe features of the text, but the whole point of the game is that you're looking for something that's both there really and not there at all at the same time. And it appears out of almost nothing after watching a TV. It's just like a stable opens up and then there's a there you know it's a very strange it's a strange space. It's utterly strange to get to, then it's strange to be on. And you move through it and interact with it in ways that are just like always unsettling what you, the player, would really like ideally like to happen. And so it creates this interesting tension the whole time that's tied to movement and how you move around the map. So the game's really about this like existential searching for something that probably no longer exists, or if it does exist, it's dilapidated and would take just like an inhuman amount of effort to rebuild. And go ahead, Nathan.
Well, just the question of control is so apt because it seems to be one of the primary axes on which this game is doing its work. And I should say here again, just stepping all the way back to like level zero, that this is a point and click adventure. So the primary way you're moving, interacting, making choices is just by clicking on the screen. It occurs to me now one way I would describe this game to maybe someone who plays games, but is more on the game side than on sort of literary or academic side would be like it's kind of like Escape from Monkey Island if it were an experimental art installation in an empty warehouse, scored by banjo. Banjo and like electronic sort of ambient music, or industrial like ambient music. But on the question of clicking, as control, as choice, even early on, you're sort of from the very beginning when you're like you get the choice to choose your dog's name. That's a kind of standard choice in games, right? Like we choose our character's name, and we don't normally think about that, but it actually is a really weird thing we're doing, right? Because the character, as we sort of have discussed in other contexts, like it's not us. The character's name pre-exists our interaction with the game world. And so we're basically like making a choice about the nature of reality and what constitutes the real in this fictional space. That is not a diegetic choice. It's an extra diegetic choice in a way. Um, Now, but that case, it's like somewhat naturalized because you could say, well, Conway gets to name his dog. Like there is a there's an in-universe explanation for why one could make this decision, even though we're sort of retroactively deciding, or we're deciding as the player what was always already the dog's name. But that gets amplified over and over again in this game to the point where the way that choice, when it happens in Elden Ring, when we choose our character's name, like just doesn't, that's just like, oh, that's just how games work. But this game constantly obtrudes the weirdness of making those sort of decisions. And I'll just choose, there's an example in every single scene, but one example that I'll choose that I'll sort of fix on for a second because we talk about it a lot when I teach this game and to my students is that moment when you first meet Shannon in the mine and you're you're doing dialogue choices. So it's the standard, RPG thing where it's like you get to choose what you're going to say. But in this case, you are choosing Shannon's responses to a phone conversation that we as the player can't hear. So the phone will read inaudible, and then we choose what Shannon says, and then the phone will read again inaudible, and we choose what Shannon says. So did I just say Shannon? We choose what Shannon says. And it just, if you wanted to try to give it a fictional justification or a diegetic justification, it's just really hard because how can we make choices as Shannon without knowing what we're responding to? And from what vantage point are we even occupying? Like, if we were the omniscient narrator, we would know what the phone is saying. If we were Shannon, we would know what the phone is saying. If we were a bystander, we wouldn't be choosing for Shannon. So it's a very complicated and strange logic of player choice. And that's all bracketing the fact that like none of this really matters. Like it's not like in Mass Effect or something where like what you say to a character is going to have tangible plot, or story branching sort of consequences later on. So I wondered I mean, Brian, did you note that scene where you're talking on the phone? And I wonder too if Justin, if you have any thoughts about this.
Yeah, I definitely thought that was odd, and I mean it's because there are these moments that seem to happen quite a bit. Not only moments where because there are scenes where totally new characters are introduced and you're, controlling those characters, right? But there are also moments where yeah, like Conway is maybe still in the scene, but you're controlling somebody else and either walking around as them or choosing their dialogue options. I'll also say too, this is jumping forward a little bit, but I just played it earlier, so I'll mention it since it's fresh in my mind. There's the moment where uh a scene replays, and it's the scene where you're kind of in this graveyard, right? So you go in the graveyard and I think it's four or five people are there. You go as Conway with Shannon off screen into this church. They call it a church or whatever. And then I think it's Junebug and Ezra stay behind. And as Ezra, you can go look at all the gravestones or whatever. And then that scene just happens again, but this time you control Conway and Shannon, and you find out what happened off screen during that time. But what's more interesting than the reveal, I think, is actually the moments before you walk off screen with them, or I guess stay on screen as the screen moves to where they're going, is that the first couple dialogue options, because you're retelling the scene, you still have the option to choose the other dialogue options that you didn't say the first time around, which is a really, really bizarre thing to do in a game. And it has no repercussions, right? I mean, it's like you're rewriting the scene of something that the other characters, by all accounts, should just disagree with you and say, wait, no, that's not what I said, or that's not what you said, or whatever. This just happened, whatever, 2 hours ago or something. I remember what I said, right? You didn't ask why you said okay or whatever, right? For example. So yeah, something weird seems to be happening in terms of, and I think this is like part of what we're kind of maybe tending toward, or part of, a larger conversation here, is that the question of who we as a player, or maybe as a narrator, because I think this is something that you in your article, Justin, you're kind of thinking about too, like where is the narrative, where is the narration coming from, like who are we as the player, are those the same things? But those questions seem to just kind of run throughout the game as far as I can tell, right? Not only shifting perspectives playfully. And this is what I think makes the game, and makes certain so-called postmodern fiction or whatever better than other kinds of so-called postmodern fiction is that it's not just shifting viewpoints for no reason. It seems to be tied up in the narrative in like a really, really important way, but also a pretty indirect way, right? Like there's a constant kind of like prismatic shifting of what we see and what we don't see and what choices we can make. And Justin, as you said, that kind of lack of control at the same time. And I'm not sure if I'm misremembering, but I think I actually remember a part where you're in the bar and you get offered a drink and you say, so what happened for me at least is I said yes, and Shannon interrupted and said no. So I don't know if that's a different scene, but again, it's like because I knew this narrative thread for Conway, and the bartender's like, all we have is whiskey, and I chose the dialogue option that said, sure, I'll take the whiskey, and Shannon interrupts and says, coffee, please, whatever, and then he's like, no, we only have whiskey, and then Shannon's like, okay, never mind then, or whatever, right? So you're right, that can either way, right? That control is like constantly wrested from you. I mean, you're interrupted by other characters after you choose your dialogue options, and those options don't get fully articulated, which is I'm not sure I've seen that happen in a game before either, right? When you're choosing a dialogue option that just gets truncated after the first syllable or whatever. Yeah.
It's interesting because the first example that I think of when I think of this kind of like distancing or like poetic kind of defamiliarization of the the player and how play works in games. I think the first example I think of is when you're playing through the sequence in it's in Act Two where you go to the Museum of Dwellings. And the Museum of Dwellings sequence, you're controlling where the characters move throughout the space, but the descriptions and the text are not. It's narrating what happened from the vantage point of security guards interviewing people who live in this museum. And so there's this moment where you're controlling the avatars the normal way you do, but you actually don't experience their experience of the Museum of Dwellings at all. There are moments where, much like in the Act 3, Act 4 sequence, when you see the two different parts of the same moment, uh, interestingly spread across time in a way that games don't usually do. Like, maybe I'm not super experienced and well read in terms of theater, but it seems like a flashback in the theatrical mode is already quite unique. But it's also the way that it's done in the game form is interesting because it incorporates not just the temporal shift, but it forces you into a different space time relationship altogether, where you're like, oh, I am in the past, even though typically we think of that kind of construction being made in language, when it comes to storytelling. Whereas in this game, it's actually through the capacity to interact with both of those like possible modalities of how you talk about that space. And I think that that kind of distancing that you see as early as the first time you click the game and you like what happens with your clicks is you set down a tent or what is it, a stake a metal stake in the ground, and then a horseshoe flies from the character, and then the character moves towards the horseshoe. Um, and so there's already just these layers and layers and layers. And you brought up the question of where we are in it. And I think that really the question of where we are in it is the question of the whole game.
Yeah.
And so I'm working on a paper that I sent to both of you where I'm talking about this subplot that kind of happens. Interestingly, it's the only really consequential decision you make in the classical game sense where you're like, it either occurs or it doesn't occur because of my choices. You meet this character named Carrington after originally starting the game in Act One, and if you meet him in Act One, you meet him throughout the game, and he's in the epilogue, all these different things, and he really is this kind of, I guess, echo of the larger question of like finding a place to dwell in, or like what things are when they don't occupy their, I guess, erratic space. I don't really know how to put it otherwise. Like art doesn't belong in a bar, but most of the time in this game, you're watching artistic performances happening in this bar that is totally chained to the debt of its citizen or of its patrons, and serves whiskey that is literally like the distilled regret and debt of these people. And it's just this endlessly reinforcing cycle of, uh, I guess we could call it like a slow economic violence, to reappropriate Rob Nixon's term from the post-colonial eco-critical dimension, but think of it also as a kind of violence done through the slow processes of, I guess, late capitalism, whatever we want to call it. And so art gets caught into this space, and really this game is the story about art forms losing their place. Like where what is art's role in this question of where do I live? What am I in living in this place? And I keep going away from like the bare bones of the text towards these things, but one of the key uh, one of the key things about the structure of this game is that it's made up of different acts, 5 acts, and there are interludes in between them. And like 3 of the interludes are all about this positionality, or like how far you are from something. The first one, Limits and Demonstrations, is literally an art exhibition or an expo, and it's implied that it's happening in the future. As this because you meet the same character, Lula Chamberlain. It's her artworks over the years, and it's a retrospective gallery designed around her work. And then the next sequence you see at the beginning of Act Two is her working at this place called the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces. She's just she dreams of being an artist. The first thing she does is reads a rejection letter from an institution that would fund her artworks and so on and so forth. So she's stuck working at this boring desk job, which ties into the question of where art is performed, where art can be located. And so the whole range of things is like that we've been discussing so far all add up to this idea of like I usually feel like I'm controlling the characters, or I usually feel like I have some capacity to inflect or influence the narration. But in this game, you really, really don't. And I think the argument it's trying to make is actually that that presupposition is a strange one. Much like I've been reading this work by a philosopher. I sent Nathan a copy or a link to this book. He talks about the idea of artistic works being intentional in like a phenomenological sense. And what I mean by that is that we experience consciousness because we intend or tend towards things in a habitual way. And I think Kentucky Route Zero is an ideal explanation of that problem when we get into created or generated worlds, uh, art worlds, that not in the like social scientific art world sense, but in the sense of this game has a world that it's building. It has rules, it has boundaries, it allows us to interact with it in certain ways, but we're never really comfortable, to be honest, ever. And slowly but surely, our agency, or what we would think of as agency, is peeled away slowly, step by step, to the point where the end of the game has us sitting in a bar watching TV. And this trend of us sitting somewhere off stage, but that actually being put on stage, is carried forward in one of the other interludes, which is the second one, where you're performing the role of a barfly within the confines or dramatic space of another play. And so you're both a performer and the audience at the same time. But as you look forward, there are performers in front of you, and as you look backwards, there's the audience behind you. And it's just complete dislocation. And I mean, it's like total alienation from the ways in which we typically think of, you know, playing for certain reasons, uh, collecting all possible endings in a game, or new game plus runs, or speed running. All are very objective based, and Kentucky Route Zero just completely defies the notion that games are really driven in that somewhat simplistic way. We tend to think of it as rules oriented around goals, which are attainable, and there's kind of this finite quality to it. But given that it's it's also an artwork, not just a game. It has this tendency towards like infinite recursion. It just constantly thinks about itself as an art form, but also games and their potential for, I mean, games are super replayable. One of the key aesthetic dimensions of games is replayability. And so it's just like this iterative process of going deeper and deeper as you yourself follow deeper and deeper into, navigating the text in the game world. So one of the key things that I think we're kind of leading towards here is the question of how the relationship between the world outside of the game and the world inside of the game are kind of reflecting each other. And I mean, there's mention of mise on a beam in an earlier podcast, but also in the email for this and the name of this meeting. And so, I mean, we can talk about that, but maybe you'll respond first to what I'm saying.
Yeah, I wanted to just really quickly take up, or maybe not so quickly, sorry guys, t take up the thread earlier. I mean, that was all really fascinating and beautiful, Justin. But you mentioned like this theme about like finding a home and also like finding a place to inhabit or to sort of realize art, and these two things are sort of related. And in fact, I mean, spoiler, Brian, but like the ending of the game brings you essentially to a home that is also a stage. Um, and I would also say that, I mean, for me, like purely subjectively, or in the kind of in the mode of sheer opinion, this has one of the most beautiful. I think I would say this has, okay, so first of all, this has one of the best endings of any game. I would, top of my head, I would say, this game, Kentucky Route Zero, the ending of Echoes of the Eye, the Outer Wilds expansion, and Final Fantasy X. Those are my three knee-jerk picks for best endings. Um, uh, Justin, I saw you have a hand, so maybe you want to chime in with a few, which I'd be very interested to hear. But I would say this is also the best and most beautiful utopian ending to any work, any game, any book, any movie I've ever experienced. Um, and I mean utopian in a really serious way. And you talked about the sort of like political, economic, social aspect of this game, which is, I think it is a big part, the idea, really resonant idea of slow economic violence. But I think one thing I love about this game is that it ends, on a note of tragedy, but also just incredible sort of utopian possibility. And that is just almost like heartbreakingly beautiful. Like I get really emotional at the end of this game, actually, in a way that I almost never do with games. Um, and it reminded me, sorry, just one quick thing. I'm gonna sort of like free associate a little bit here, but I'm reminded of like, oh God, I think it was an episode of Mad Men. So again, like I'm the podcast's resident normie here, but a character I forget when in that show, but points out that the Greek word utopia contains both the idea of like a good place, because EU or EU in Greek means good, like as in like euphoria. Um, but then OU means no, or it's a negation. So, or it's both a good place or the beautiful place and a non-place or a place that doesn't exist. Um, and it just strikes me that like Kentucky Road Zero, especially in the latter sections, like really is really opening up both sides of that notion of utopia, even down to the point of like the zero being a zero, being like this sort of like it's either a gesture of negation and nothingness and non-existence, or it's a kind of what it really is, I think, more accurately described as in this game is a kind of positive version of infinity, or possibility. That the way we inhabit the zero on multiple levels as we drive around it in circles, but also in the final act, you play as uh, a cat or a dragonfly, and you're not sure which, tracing constant circles through the map screen. That it thickens the idea of like infinity into kind of like a positive embodied experience. That sounds like really jargony and kind of like mystical, but that's how I feel about this game, is that it like injects the idea of infinity, uh, saves the idea of infinity from nothingness and turns it into a kind of like sublime experience of possibility. Maybe I'll just stop there because I feel like I'm hedging it. I'm sort of verging into theological sort of like speculations, but it's sort of the sort of thing that this game really does inspire.
Well, I mean, I think just to jump in quickly because I'm interested, Justin, in what if you have a response to that. But I mean, Nathan, that totally makes sense. I mean, infinity, this is the difference between, infinity that's always plus one, like the infinity of something like addiction or infinity of obsession or something like this, versus the infinity that, understands and kind of accounts for fragmentation and gaps and the fact that you can't have every single dialogue option in the game or something like that. Of course, you could play through it a million times, but there's an infinity. I mean, if this, as you said earlier, right, if this is like a sort of infinite kind of game, then that's precisely why, right? It's because there are these kind of losses and fragments and so it is positive, I guess, if we allow it to. I mean, I think that's also like a dispositional thing, right? Uh yeah, I don't know. I'll pause there because I don't know, Justin, if you wanted to respond.
Yeah, so I actually put my hand up at some point because we can see each other video. Because I was thinking about an example when we were talking earlier, and I just wanted to throw it in there very quickly as a kind of concretization of what we were talking about earlier. Then I will respond. Um, in Final Fantasy IX, there is a moment where the character Garnet, who's a princess, decides to change her name, and the game suggests a name to you, um, Dagger, because she asks what object you're holding, and you're holding a dagger. Um, but you can just erase Dagger and rename her actual name. But the game doesn't understand that you've done this, and it just acts as though she's got this secret name that hides her identity. Uh, which is very people laugh about this a lot. It's one of the few times where naming a character in a Final Fantasy game actually did have diegetic kind of glitchy consequences. And I think that this game, Kentucky Route Zero, is sort of familiar with that strange, strange feedback loop. And this is what I was thinking about the whole time. Maybe it's better even to describe the zero as a kind of feedback loop and to describe all of the different processes, the social, historical, political, economic, um, religious or theological, all these different dimensions are kind of stuck in this never-ending, I'm being ironic a bit, positive feedback loop, right? And actually, I've heard very divided opinion about the end of this game. A lot of people think it's very, very bleak, and a lot of people think it's very, very hopeful. And I think it's both literally in the same moment. And this is one of the interesting things about this game is that, I mean, positive feedback loops are things like I really like sugar, so I'll eat sugar, and then that craving for sugar will make me want more and more and more. There's a inevitable entropy in that process, so it does fragment as well. And we're kind of seeing the entropy of those positive feedback loops. And at the same time, this is I'm writing a paper comparing Kentucky Route Zero and its kind of generative structure to Outer Wilds, which is really funny, and how it does like interactive storytelling in this way. And I'm now thinking that actually the thing that unites these two texts might be that they're really about accepting that negative feedback is required for anything to progress. Like you have to accept entropy and death. That's the point of Outer Wilds. It's literally this never-ending positive feedback loop, which is just denial. And then that denial is so literalized and made so resonant in the DLC, where they literally create a virtual space that allows them, it's an echo chamber of positive feedback, where the universe just continues to be stuck in this loop forever. Sorry, spoilers to those who haven't played Outer Wilds. But in Kentucky Route Zero, the zero itself is this kind of feedback loop. And I was thinking, it's like almost a skeleton of a place, but it's also, and one of the things that they've talked about a lot that again unifies a lot of the parts of what this game's trying to do. One of the major influences is a film called Scan Processor Studies, and it's this experimental visual art work that like takes what is it like anodyne like basically CRT TVs and kind of like puts magnets on them and creates faces like at the Mountains of Madness kind of like cosmic horror faces, mountains of sound and sound waves, and it's just this interesting relational feedback loop that is it's always going to have that feedback, but how you place the magnet when you put the magnet closer or further away, it's this kind of resonant thing. And again, I think Kentucky Route Zero again makes a clear comment on this, not just through the detachment of your control and your perspective, but also on the idea that these systems are self-sustaining in that in a not hopeful way. And what actually counters it is the local dimension. So not just a home as a stage in the final act, but like your local bar where you go to commiserate with people. Or what's another good example? Hearing folk songs playing on a TV, which are then reproduced in the game's story world or in the boundary between inner and outer diegetic or non-diegetic or extra diegetic space. You have this Greek chorus that are they're playing instruments and contextualizing what's happening in the story through music, which never really narrates. And yet the music here narrates, and it kind of guides and shapes and structures this breakthrough of the player entering and intervening in this never-ending positive feedback loop, which is why I think the game feels somewhat hopeful. You can choose to have people kind of rebuild this community that's been destroyed, and the game constantly makes you think about art as this local thing. When I brought up the aura before or erratic dimensions of art, there's a certain prioritization or appreciation for art that is local. It's engaged with its context and its surroundings in a way that, for example, we have this place called the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces that you start Act Two in. What they're doing is they're just like reclaiming everything because no one can afford to live anymore, and the debt is so out of hand that they literally can't occupy their own dwellings. Their dwellings become a museum. It's a thing of the past. And so the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces gives permission to different characters to use space in different ways, but it's so decontextualized. It's so not local that spaces are just kind of like wrongly appropriated throughout. And you end up seeing that artworks are placed in the wrong context throughout in a way that, or in a different context, and it's kind of like trying to negotiate whether that context actually works. And of course, it ends with the community where there's this unfinished home that's also a stage, and all of the cast of the play of Kentucky Route Zero band together and sing a hymn. And so it's just like resonant all the way across with this idea of, engaging in local individual performance, even to the point I think where storytelling in the game itself falls along the lines of this like oral storytelling encounter. Like a lot of what's narrated to you is hearsay. It's not presented to you intact. There's one sequence where it really is, but narration occurs when people are telling you like stories within the story, right? It's always contextualized as even the strange stuff or even the player's perspective, which should be outside of the text, gets folded into it in a way that we don't usually see games do. They don't draw your attention to it quite as much. The only example I can really think of is like immersive Sims, where you have this like tinkering mentality to control systems that then unfold and lead to processes of gameplay that are relatively predictable, although they do it's like on the edge of predictability. Metal Gear Solid 3 is a good example.
Yeah, just thinking of systems, where you ended there, Justin, like, I would say one of the potential critiques of this game, and I've heard it from my students too when I teach it, is that like, yeah, this isn't a game because there are no interesting systems, and that goes to, in a way, it's like it resonates with this much larger, broader sort of perspective that one could take on games that has, famously been taken on games in the academic world, which is like, the essence of a game is its systems, is its gameplay and its rules, and everything else is just extraneous. And actually, games should stop trying to be like movies or like books because that's not what games are good. That's not what the medium is good at. And I think both all of us agree that this is like a kind of fallacious position, for a lot of reasons. Partly because books,
Games
as
were books for a very long time. I'm so sorry for interrupting, but like
yeah,
games were literally books for a very long time.
and also books are interactive, so it's like there's a lot of just false distinctions that are going there. But um, for me, I would say, to speak the language of that critique, I would say, well, at the very least, there's one thing that games do incredibly well too, and that's space. It's inhabiting space and creating atmosphere. And I would say, going back to the ending, that part of what makes it so just like ravishingly beautiful is that I have never in my life experienced, whether in a film, a novel, and certainly not a game, the such a palpable evocation of a humid, sunny morning after a torrential downpour. Like the feeling just from the quality of the light, the sort of the stillness and kind of recursiveness of your actions, the sense of just like kind of total relaxation and also mournfulness, but like a kind of like relaxation of the elements. And of course the sound design, like just like the kind of thick. I talked about this actually in a different episode, an earlier episode, but just like the thick wall of like insect noise. At least that's how I at least remember that final scene. Um, and this game is just extraordinarily good at conjuring the atmosphere of particular spaces. And one other that I'll just mention is not to get us off track too much, but Brian, I remember we were texting earlier about the game, and you mentioned like liking the exhibition interlude. I mean, what game has ever captured like the kind of ambient, physical, embodied like atmosphere of a museum as well as this? Just like the sort of like mix of like almost like soporific relaxation and quiet with a kind of like extreme mental focusing and stimulation, and dim lighting, like that the what's it called? I always want to say title and registration, which is the Death Cab for Cutie song, but it's what, title and demonstration? What's
Limits and demonstration.
limits and limits and demonstration? Um, like it's just a brilliant, beyond all the ideas that are going. And this is again typical of this game. Beyond like the really interesting sort of thought and writing and perfect imitation of museum sort of like little write-ups for experimental art, like it just captures this feeling of like, yes, that's what it's like to walk around a museum of modern art, and the game is just incredibly good at conjuring those spaces, particularly with this like fairly simplified two-dimensional, you know, um, uh, mode of representation.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say like, games, a few things, I guess, a few thoughts. Games are just by nature atmospheric, right? But I think Kentucky Route Zero like prompts us to reflect a lot more on the atmosphere that's occurring. Nathan, like you said, especially, I mean, a museum within a game is already a kind of mise en abîme, right? Like we're presented with an artistic space within an artistic medium. Um, but Justin, you also mentioned this film that was it scan processor studies, you said, where they're using magnets to manipulate a television. I mean, thinking of magnets makes me think of the specific piece in that exhibit, which is and this maybe will help me like refer back a little bit to our podcast opening gambit, which is partly to think about what's held in common across different mediums, for example, games and literature, or in this case, like, maybe music and games or whatever. Um, that first interludes exhibit includes a piece where magnetic tape, so cassette tape, is segmented and pinned up on a wall, and the exhibit goer has to just like rub the playhead on it. So for people who don't know as much about, cassettes or, tape players and taking them apart or whatever, magnetic tape is magnetized, right? It goes through the playhead. This is what produces the noise. But if you break open a cassette, you have the spool of tape, you can still play it, right? You can feed it through a cassette player if you kind of, jerry rig it a little bit and set yourself up. There are some tricks to do this, and I have a little experience, doing tape manipulation as kind of like an experimental sound practice or whatever. But you can play tapes upside down, you can play them backwards, you can play them in reverse, whatever. But you can also crumple them up and then play them, and you will hear that crumpledness, right? Like if you crumple up a cassette tape and then play it, you're going to hear it's going to sound a lot more staticky and sort of deteriorated, and of course, if you magnetize tape, it will partly erase the tape, but not fully, right? So it is a incredibly tactile medium. Um, and I think that maybe this is my question for you. Maybe this is another like more broad mise en abîme for the game itself as a work of art, is that maybe there's like kind of a metaphorical tactility that we're like circling around here because we get other instances of that weird degradation within the game. So that, there's the moment where I think it's when Conway's leg gets fixed. He's given some kind of drug or whatever, right? And the letters get all messed up on the screen. Same thing happens when you get to that computer, which is another moment we haven't touched on yet. But the computer where you end up playing kind of a text adventure game first has to be like sort of demagnetized, right? To be able to actually read the text that it's putting out. But I think in like even a larger and like you know, less instance specific sense, this idea of like tactility of medium is really, I mean, certainly I think this is related to the question of where we are, who we are in the game and where we are, right? Like if the game is on the same plane as life, or if art is on the same plane, Justin, as I think you've like really nicely suggested at the beginning here, of life, like this kind of tactility is super important, right? I wonder, yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts about like these, like particular pieces like that, because I know that in your essay you wrote about the restaging of a work by Robert Frost as a play that kind of, occurs within the game. But there are so many works of art, there's so many kind of artistic moments or instances in the game where we could probably find other moments of this kind of recursivity that seem instructive.
Yeah. So actually this nicely ties everything together for me. The um so when you're in limits and demonstration, you're looking at that art piece. It's called hold on, overdubbed Nam Pike installation in the style of Edward Packer. And Edward Packer is the first, adventure book, choose your own adventure kind of author. And the Nam Pike is an experimental video artist who, well worth watching. There's a Netflix documentary about Nam Pike. It's awesome. Huge, huge influence on this game. And um, so Nam Pike created this piece. I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but it was literally like magnetized strips of audio tape where you could collaborate with your friends and take the recording head of and put it on different parts of and make music together. But this is overdubbed in the style of a text adventure fiction. And so you're playing through the different parts of the strip of tape in this, quite literally interactive way that, you choose which parts to proceed along, and it's kind of reenacting that. But at the same time, there's this, um, it's still being given to you from this really specific vantage point. In this case, characters who before that you've only seen as disembodied ghosts or part of a band that is the Greek chorus of the whole thing. And then eventually they kind of enter, there's a metaleptic shifting of these characters. Not just they're like almost in a side story, and then that side story becomes the story itself in ways that you won't have seen yet. And I think that the next paper that I'm going to be writing is about the intersections of metalepsis, crossing narrative levels or breaking the threshold between stories within stories, but also levels of narration or detachment from the diegesis itself, and the mise en abîme structure, which when I think they're put together, what you get is the proportional dimensions of the space itself. It creates the space while also giving you the proportional sense of it. And so space is not just like the physical or material boundaries of something, but it's also the ways in which you're kind of like architecturally guided to move through them or to interact or intersect with them. And so what keeps happening is that you think you're, in a museum, this is what I do, but immediately you're supposed to interact with this piece in a way that is explicitly tactile. Like you're grabbing the technology itself, the material itself, and you're part of that as almost like an entity in the artwork in a way that early performance art that was more focused on spectatorship and participation tried to do. And later that became popular in the fictional literary sense with choose your own adventure stories, which led to a lot of tabletop games and collaborative gameplay as a kind of performative and interpretive enterprise at the same time. So again, I mean, everything in this game is like hyper densely connected to everything else. But the idea that I talk about in the paper about Carrington trying to perform this play, like it literally is, or it's a poem about characters who are debating whether or not they owe a former worker of theirs who abandoned his post whether they owe him the dignity of dying in their home because he thinks of it as their home. And it's strange because the 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 play that he's trying to perform never occurs despite you trying to help him find a venue to stage it. And you, as you're wandering through the game, you find all these different locations and you recommend them. But in each of those locations, you find a couple really key things. One of which is you find media that's kind of been left alone and you have to choose to play it or not. And it's this tactile, it tries to bring the tactile dimension back by forcing you to choose playing these things which we typically think of as interpassive. If you put a record on, your record player is actually listening to the record for you, right? Whereas this is trying to take, you have to take, it's almost like taking uh pieces of a record, spinning it on a thing, and having you like hold the needle over top of it, and then the generative results of that kind of come out as a story. And my PhD thesis was about generativity more broadly as an artistic category, I suppose. And one of the key things about generativity is that it kind of prioritizes randomness, the encounter of the audience with the artwork, producing unexpected results, or the artwork itself kind of transcending its intended or the author's intention. But I actually think one of the key things this game's trying to argue the whole time is that what you're aiming for when you play a game very quickly falls away in the moment of, for example, even just a simple example with combat. Like you don't always remember where you're going. The games constantly have to be like, you're going here, you're going here, you're going here. Can you get this for me? Which then leads you into like I can't play Skyrim, for example. I know you talked about it. I can't play it. I just find it utterly impossible to navigate in a way that makes sense to me. Morrowind was the last one because it had a sense of place that the other later games didn't seem to have for me. And this is tying to what you were talking about, Nathan, with the feeling of being in a town that's covered in like the sweaty dew of a morning after a catastrophe is a perfect way to describe it. And my work on this game started with the idea of fine tuning or playing with moods, and it was a bit of a pun, and it was based on the idea of Stimmung, which Hans-Ulrich Gumbrich talks about a lot, but it's one of the oldest concepts. Kant talks about Stimmung all the time. Lukács talks about film as having properties that are atmospheric or like double mimetic and thus double atmospheric. Very strange way to look at it, but when you wrap your head around it, it makes a lot of sense. And what happened is that there's this kind of so mise en abîme creates the proportions or directions or intentions of the work on a smaller scale within the frame of a story within a story or a play within a play or a plot within a plot. And it's also called interior duplication or recursion. And it's interesting to me mostly because it creates this paradoxical space where for example, originally it started out as this concept, mise en beam, of like a shield within, like a heraldic shield, where there's an image within an image, and that smaller image displays the whole shield itself within the smaller proportions of one panel of the shield, which, uh, in terms of like literal heraldry, they didn't do that. But the concept makes sense, and it was a term coined by Andre Gide, although there were many examples of this being talked about or being present in artworks before this. And Gide talks about the idea of the writer observing themselves in the process of writing. So the way he describes it is an interesting paradox because he has this image of looking in a mirror, seeing himself writing, but when he sees his reflection, it's looking down at the page writing. It's like immersed in the writing while watching oneself write. So it's this weird, strange concept that is very, very loose. But it really is just trying to describe, for example, in Hamlet, the play within a play structure. And what happens is uh, quite interesting because the play within a play in Hamlet is both part of the story of Hamlet. It happens in the diegesis, but it's also crucially aimed at the audience, kind of proportioning the work and telling you, reinforcing for you what the work is, what the thrust or the intention of the work is. But it's a paradox because at the same time, really, Hamlet is about the fact that Hamlet knows full well the proportions of the story he's in, and he doesn't want to be in it. And so there's this weird paradoxical writer watching himself write, person watching himself live in the process of living those decisions that he doesn't feel are his own decisions. And so there's this infinite recursion. And so eventually, Mise on a Beam becomes the idea of two mirrors facing each other. And when you think about it, it's very interesting because that kind of produces this ecosystemic or spatial image. And so the two mirrors create the boundaries of this infinite looping space that has no origin. It's both diegetic and extra diegetic simultaneously because it's not just showing the reader how to read the work, but at the same time, it's the work reflecting on itself within the story and characters perceive it. So it's diegetic and representational at the same time, which is why I know that you mentioned me on an earlier podcast saying that I think all games are mise en abîme. I think all artworks have some crucial reflective dimension, and that self-reflexive capacity is what generates the spaces themselves in the first place, and kind of unifies us as the receivers of an aesthetic experience. At the same time, we feel responsible for that experience in a way that authors already have felt and are kind of communicating to us in a strange way. Not to get, that's super theoretical, but the mise on a beam structure ties us again to Xanadu itself, the computer program that you manipulate, where it actually becomes unclear if that game is what generated the world of Kentucky Route Zero itself or not, because it describes the origins of the story in a way that is like strange. It suggests that there's a glitch in the computer that has made the world the way that it is. At least that's how I was reading it. And so there's this weird confusion based on the paradox that mise en abîme creates the space that it's represented. It generates and represents simultaneously in a way that we don't think of, but really that's what art is constantly doing. And so the rules or the boundaries or the systems we think of games usually having, I teach them to my students as kind of the forces which generate and represent the space of a game to us. And so the easiest example, the most practical example I can think of, I'm a Canadian, so I really like hockey. Hockey used to be just dreadful to watch, and it was not very popular for a really long time because they had this rule called the two-line pass. So you could not pass the puck across two lines anywhere on the ice except for in the past the red line or center ice line. And what they did is they took that away, and the game immediately became more exciting because for 20 years you couldn't score goals because there was this perfect strategy for containing a team defensively if they were trying to cross without crossing those two lines. They took that away, changed the parameters of the space, changing the rules, and suddenly the game is more popular than it's ever been, and arguably it's a different generative space.
I just wanted to chime in quickly, Justin, on Xanadu again, which Brian, you also brought up. That's in a way like the core, for me, it's like the core of the game. It's like the core, it's the thesis statement of the game in some ways, partly just because you find the game inside the game, you know. You play a text adventure game inside a text adventure game. And I just wanted to make one very small point. It's kind of obvious point for those who have gotten there, but Brian, I'm not sure if you got to that part yet. But it's good. I think it's good grounding for the listeners too. So Xanadu is a version of Colossal Cave Adventure. So the first text adventure game, I think 1977, sometime around then. And what's really cool is that basically you have this gesture towards the origins of the gaming medium and the generic medium, you know, or a kind of generic origin for any kind of adventure game whatsoever. Like, you know, in some ways that spawns out that sort of bifurcates into sort of real-time adventure games like the game Adventure, you know, where you're moving your character around and exploring spaces, but they all kind of like they have this sort of common root, you know, of this just exploring a purely textual space. And what's really cool about Kentucky Route Zero, and I think this is emblematic of the game as a whole, is that it's both gesturing toward and doing really interesting conceptual work with like it's kind of a certain origin point for the medium and the genre, but it's also making that intensely local. So going back to Justin, your idea of like sort of local businesses and communities, you know, that um, Kentucky, Colossal Cave Adventure was inspired largely, as I've read, by the creator. Is it Will Calder or is it Don Woods? I forget which one who came. Someone came in later and added stuff to the game, but exploring Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, and so Kentucky Route Zero is like it's an homage to like the Kentuckiness of the adventure genre as a whole, in a way, or it's like sort of reanimating that aspect, that kind of local, again, like physical, embodied, environmental, atmospheric element of like the physical space, like that birth games themselves, and the physical space that birth game spaces. And of course, there's something generative about a cave system too, or something random and kind of almost infinite about a cave system. So I again, it's like the game has this way of like relentlessly taking ideas and making them palpable and tangible and physical, and local, you know, in a way that's really special. And that goes to Brian, your thought about like materiality and like tangibility too. Like that's just a constant theme that's surfaced at every level of this game.
Also, in the relationship between, analog and digital, which is probably the most straightforward way that the game kind of presents itself to us. Like it's presented as a series of videotapes, or like you save your game on different forms of analog media. People are recorded and preserved in physical devices, including physical spaces. You'll find a church that is in a warehouse that is literally named Random Access Self Storage, which, by the way, Random Access is the name of the Namjoon Pike installation I was mentioning before. It's called Random Access. And it does the same thing to the storytelling in that installation, the overdubbed Namjoon Pike piece, because it's 15 years of storytelling condensed into a series of just like traversable paths. And the characters have to kind of discuss and describe what they want to do, where they want to take it. Like, do you want to cheat and skip to this part of the story? And in a way it's an interesting commentary on that role of the player as like semi-narrator, semi-not narrating that I think we've kind of danced around the whole time. And one of the one of the key things that I do want to bring up is at the same time there's this like strong stance towards the local, the material. There's still there's still this deep, profound sense of alienation. And I don't know if you've gotten to the fourth act where you're riding the mucky mammoth, Brian, but there's a point where you're on a boat going down this river and you choose where to go. Like they stop at different points and you can go to those points following certain characters or stay on the boat and do different things, have different conversations. So there's always this just like choice paralysis about where to go. But at the same time, like you really can't control where it goes. And then this character after the fact narrates to you what happened off screen. So there's this always this like weird tension of I don't want to miss this. I care about these characters. I want to go here and then I want to go there. But you can't physically touch all of it. So you're always seeing the ways in which these stories have to be mediated to you just because you're finite. You literally cannot engage with all of these things. And I want to draw attention that there's a character that you meet on this boat. There's a very weird kind of aberrant narrative that happens, but the more you think about it, the more she resonates with what we're talking about. Her name's Clara, and she's from Europe, and she's playing a performance at the end of Act Four, and so she's kind of like touring around, riding the Mucky Mammoth, which is this ferry boat that takes you along the river. And at the end, she plays a theremin, which is the only instrument that you don't have to physically touch to play. It's this interesting, but like what you're shown with her, for example, there's a point where you see a phone conversation and you actually see her home country depicted. And whereas with Shannon, you get a phone call and you don't really get exposed to what's happening there. So there's this weird playing with that. It's never one thing or the other. And it's almost like dematerializing certain things, uh, or we're watching that like entropy of splayed out, spools of tape. They're very flammable. They're very, like they're very easily subject to degradation, um, despite the fact that we're saving them. And I think maybe that's part of the whole impetus towards remembering and so on. Like antiques are a form of remembering that drives the whole story. Uh, but it's also, memories past the time of our capacity to actually adequately or appropriately remember them is probably something that future discussions might need to have.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks for coming on. This has been really great and super.
Cool.
And I guess I just wanted to bring up one last thing by way of conclusion, which is I think this game has one of the greatest bait and switch intros of all time, and I'm not even sure if it's intentional. It almost feels like a joke, but it could be just like something that people told them to put in for playtesting, in playtesting. But the game actually begins with with a real puzzle. The only
Mhm.
puzzle, and it's the only bit of like real gameplay in the whole game, is you get a lantern and you're told to go in a basement and you have to find a dice. And the only
Mhm.
way to find it is to turn your lantern off. So it gestures
Mhm.
toward Colossal Cave Adventure 2, where the first thing you do is pick up several objects, including a lamp. Um, but it's this funny moment where, like, yeah, there's a kind of rudimentary puzzle where you have to do precisely the thing that one wouldn't do in a game. It's sort of like Outer Wilds, Echoes of the Eye, where
Mhm.
there's one of the central puzzles there is about leaving your lamp. Totally brilliant. Um, but it's totally misrepresents the game because you're never going to have to make any kind of inference, sort of ludic gameplay oriented inference like that ever again, as I remember. And that's all just to say, A, like it's a funny little opening. B, I wonder if by policy we on Authors Act Twice have to give this game a 0 out of 10 because, as I always say, Brian, you got to keep your magic lantern lit.
Gotta keep it lit.
Thanks, thanks again for coming on, Justin.